Hello, welcome back to Blender Sushi LiveENODING. In this episode, we're gonna talk about cycles, materials, just the very basics, and I will also be using animation nodes to do a little bit of animations. So yeah, let's just get started, and this is gonna be a bit of improvisation, so should be pretty fun. So let's go to compositing and switch to cycles render. And I will turn on cycles material and apply a material into this guy. So just create a new material. So this is a cycles node. By default, it has diffuse, shader, assigned into material output. Let me save this as AN and cycles. So I found that the easiest to get started is really for you maybe to use like something like image texture, and then you open some kind of image, and then you start to deal with a mapping and texture coordinate. So this should be good for you to get started. Sometimes you also want to have geometry and play with things like pointiness, back facing, etc. But for now, let's see. I will be using MixShader. And instead of diffuse material, I will be using emission. So I will have two emissions, just two different color in the opposite side. And let's try play around with these two value. So by default, if you plug this into the shader, what you're gonna get is some kind of color that's a blending between these two color. So that's what this factor value is for. It's always between 0 and 1. What really cool about vector here is that you can put whatever into the vector, whatever grayscale value between white and black, and that's gonna kind of affect the blending between these two emission shader. So let's try with noise texture, for example, or checker texture. You have a lot of texture here that you can play with. Wave texture is actually pretty cool. So whatever you have here with the texture, you can plug in like generated. Oh, let me actually reduce the sampling so it's not too noisy. Just sample it once. So if I plug in generated texture coordinate into this noise texture, we're gonna have some kind of vector that we can plug into. So that's cool, and that's pretty basic, right? You can also use, of course, checker texture. You can sometimes you just plug in the color. It's gonna do conversion for you, but you can see there's a difference. Be careful with that. So here, checker pattern, and it's affecting the factor of MixShader. And you can also, of course, use the wave texture. And with the wave, you have a couple of options. And I think this, you tend to want to make this 0.5 if you want to do this kind of properly, like center the circle. I think it's actually minus 0.5. So maybe that's what you want. Maybe here as well. So that's actually looks like 3D texture. That's pretty neat. Sometimes with the factor here, you actually want to have more control. So you use something like color ramp. So with color ramp, you can kind of push the blending so it's like more contrasty. So that's actually kind of important as well. And sometimes you do this and then you animate it. Maybe not that way. You can use like a multiple mapping, and maybe sometimes you have to try and error. Oh well, don't worry about that for now. So you can see how the texture coordinate and texture mapping can work together with the noise texture that's being generated, plug into color ramp. Color ramp basically help you to give like a high contrast, like a really sharp edges like this, but you can always blur it, kind of. You can always go back and blend it. Sometimes you actually use like a math nodes, and with this guy you can use something like less than or greater than, and then you can have something that's really sharp. There is only like 0 and 1 between these two values. So that's pretty easy to understand, right? So the factor is really important. And let's say you are using something else. Maybe use separate XYZ. So we know that texture coordinate will give coordinate of some sort. You can, if the object have UV, you can use the UV as well. This guy doesn't have UV. You can have, you can play around with this. If you separate the XYZ, and then you start to use math like add, multiply, and sine. So you know that's, let's say generated have value between some value, maybe -1 and 1. I'm not quite sure, but there is this XYZ value that we can actually use for the factor. So plug this into the factor, and you can see there's a blend between these two values. So that's something that we can offset using this add, and we can also multiply, right? And we get stripes. There's a difference between generated and objects, and also normal, whichever. But I think generated and objects normally what you want to use. You can offset it, and this sine value has doesn't seem to have any effect. Sometimes you also can use modulo. Modulo, that's an important one. So you can get like a fancy effects like that. Use a small value like that. Multiplier, of course. So yeah, that's pretty cool. So that's an offset, that's a multiplier. This add and multiply is something that you will use quite often. Let's get rid of modulo for now, just a sign. So with this value that we separated into x, y, z, we really can use the x, the y, and the z. Not only that, you can also, of course, do more math, and if you are mixing x and y, you get like diagonal pattern. Let's keep it simple for now, just the x, and let's do one more thing. So this is just emission goes into this guy. Sometimes you actually want to keep it simple, just use like a MixRGB. So you can have two color, and then you do the modulation like this, plug into that guy. So this way you have just a single shader. It's much simpler, but mix shader and add shader is really powerful. Just keep that in mind. You can keep mixing and blending shader that way, and you just blend using the factor. So this is really the main idea when you're using cycles and you start to get more intermediate to advanced level. You are very likely mixing and blending color. So that's what Blender is all about, I think. So there's a string, there's a mix, there's this guy, of course, we can control. We can add this, we can animate that. There is one actually really powerful nodes, hue saturations. I really quite like this node. It's quite powerful. Sometimes people use it this way. It's kind of neat. You actually plug the color into the hue, and then you control the color using this guy. And this guy is actually quite cool because you can switch to animation nodes and then control it. Just use cycles material and animate this hue saturation value and animate the color using animation nodes. So I really quite like this method. So this is powerful. You can see the nodes does not update cycles, but you can kind of force it. If you go to animation nodes, turn on all these three, and now you can animate it. You can see it interactive, right? So that's pretty cool. If we have Susan head, we can assign the same material for Suzanne, and you can play around with it. Oh yeah, if you're using shader, of course, don't forget you can use something like transparent shader, plug it, and you get this neat looking effect. Let me just put in also the color ramp and make stronger contrast. So now you can actually animate this. And when animating shader, you can keyframe it here, but sometimes actually if you want to control it using procedurally using animation nodes, you can easily do that, of course. All this should be something that you can control using animation nodes. So this is a math node. So that's the name, and we go to cycles, get to the math node. Let's see if we can control this value. Okay, that's of course something that you can use control using frame, and just plug that into this guy. If it's gonna be too fast, just multiply it. This is actually really cool techniques. Once you start animating using animation nodes procedurally, you can start to make really complex procedurals material. So let's get back to this shader, and you can see the shader is now cycling in hue while it is also animating the stripes in that direction. At any point in time, this is interactive. You can change this value. Maybe just use pointiness. Maybe pointiness also pretty cool. Very useful. Multiply the pointiness, and you get these neat effects. So there you go. That's a quick look on cycle material. I'm kind of touching some of the very basics, but also this get into intermediate level pretty quickly. But play around with it and see how see whether you can mix and match shader. Let's say with this stripe, you can mix and match it 3 different XYZ value so that you get stripes at all 3 XYZ directions. So yeah, hopefully this is useful. So again, with cycles, it's really if you want to understand the mixing and blending using the Factor, you kind of it's kind of a good start, I think. So yeah, give it a try and let me know what you think, and I'll see you next time. Thank you. Bye.